I have seen the new face of horror, and its name is Clive Barker Film Adaptations. I am paraphrasing Stephen King there, of course. Stephen King being an American horror writer whose words need to be stapled onto just about everything they can in the hopes of drawing favourable comparisons. For example, the young adult series Gone has Like Stephen King Meets Lord of the Flies as a description, and Clive Barker's Hellraiser has I have seen the new face of horror, and its name is Clive Barker, stapled on top of it. This is Pointless Witticisms, the thing where I normally talk about things that I don't think matter too much in one way or another, but I think a fair few people have heard about Hellraiser in some form or another. If you haven't, Hellraiser is a horror franchise about bondage-themed demons that want to kill, murder, torture, and perpetuate negative stereotypes that conflate sexuality with violence. They're sort of a reactionary panic thing to the 80s moral decay and the threat of bondage destroying traditional marriages. It's a little bit complicated. Now, the first of the Hellraiser films, released in 1985, is an adaptation of horror writer Clive Barker's book The Hellbound Heart, a story about sex and violence that is adapted to the big screen pretty much one-to-one, with the exception that Pinhead in the book is, well, feminine presenting, and there is also a giant spooky engineer whose face you cannot see in the book, rather than a sort of scorpion thing with its head where its genitalia should be in the film. And there's also even more sex stuff in the book, quite a bit more. I do intend to keep this review PG-13 or so, beyond like saying the word sex or violence a fair few times. Now, the protagonist of the film is Kirsty Cotton, a young and innocent woman who gets caught up in stuff, and that's about it, really. She's, like, very sort of typical 80s fare, rather than, like, I don't think there's hugely much you can say about her character, although her performance works well enough. Frank Cotton is her uncle, a wicked and dead man who has returned from another world of sex and violence to commit sex and violence. Julia Cotton is Kirsty's stepmother, a woman who descends into evil for the sake of longing and romance that have been long absent from her marriage. The night before her wedding, her husband's brother tempted her with danger and excitement. Finally, Pinhead is a spooky demon that says spooky things. He's more of a mascot to the film series than a character in a lot of the Hellraiser films, really. You add them all together, and the plot is that a young woman deals with family drama after her uncle comes back from the dead to eat the living, while her stepmother pursues an affair with him behind her husband's back. And then a magic box gets opened, demons show up, and a whole lot of violence happens. You see, there's a magic box or whatever that summons Pinhead, and that's important thing in the Hellraiser films, but really there's nothing more complicated one can say about magic box that summons spooky demons. Now, Hellraiser, as a film series, has a fair bit of sex and sexual violence, but all those aspects of the film tend to get ignored in favour of the thing that everyone remembers, the cooler image of Doug Bradley wearing makeup and bondage gear while he commits regular sort of violence with hooks and chains and stuff. The demon Pinhead, who he's called Pinhead because he has pins in his head. He is an iconic part of horror, and he is the only constant character in the Hellraiser series, even as it descends into a franchise worth of sequels. What began as low-budget horror films with gross-out effects kind of just stays perfectly true to itself, really. People will say that the Hellraiser sequels are kind of silly or whatever, but they all maintain the same sort of core, dark aesthetic, spooky demons, box that opens stuff, sexual themes. And yeah, there are ways and there are films that differ a bit from the formula. I've only seen 8 of the Hellraiser films myself, and they're all the ones that Doug Bradley stars as Pinhead in. And that sounds a bit snobbish of me, probably. There are some elitists that say the franchise went even further downhill without Doug Bradley, but I still need to have a look in to see if they do. And I do intend to talk about every sequel I've seen at some point or another, because I really like Hellraiser. It's just sort of neat in an edgy sort of way. Now, what makes Hellraiser unique? It has neat-looking costume design. The best costume of this film is, of course, well, it could go to Uncle Frank and his skinless look when he returns from the dead, and the special effects in a scene where he sort of, like, drags himself out of the floorboards, slowly piecing himself back together from a skeleton through to, like, a full man, is really neat. But, of course, Pinhead's iconic character design is the real winner of this film. Tall, dark, pins in his head, little cut-out strips on his chest that show little skin and belly. He carries himself with a bit more jolly in this film, and that makes what he represents all the more unsettling. There's, of course, an honourable mention that has to go to one of the side demons or whatever that There's more Cenobites than just Pinhead. They tend to just be spooky demons that stand slightly behind him, making faces at you. And the Chatterer is one of the iconic ones, an eyeless monster with his lips pulled back, so he's sort of got a big smile, and you can see his teeth, which always keep clicking together. Sort of deal. It's kinda creepy, but not like... in a sort of, like, campish way. Now, why should you watch Hellraiser? Because it's got gory fun as only the 1980s can deliver, and a soundtrack that's actually really nice and emotional at times. Now, there's a secret bonus soundtrack that you can track down online that was intended for the film, but never actually made it. Clive Barker had wanted to get the band Coil to do the music for the Hellraiser franchise, because, according to anecdote, their music once made him physically ill, and, you know, that'd fit with the gore, schlock horror thing that Hellraiser has going. And the unreleased themes for Hellraiser are certainly eerie and fitting, but I'll note that they lack the orchestral pomp that composer Cristopher Young's Hellraiser score has. It's like watching an opera at times, and I really enjoyed the Hellraiser score and just how much it elevates these little scenes. Like, villainess Julia Cotton has managed to find something that once belonged to the man she'd had an affair with, and she's, like, remembering that, and there's this sort of, like, building score behind it that's partly her theme. It's called The Hellbound Heart, after the Hellraiser book that, well, after the novel that inspired the Hellraiser film, but that was adapted to make the Hellraiser film. It's called The Hellbound Heart because at the core of that story is Julia and her actions as much as, like, Frank or Kirsty's or anything. She's my favourite character, actually, Julia Cotton, and she gets a very good role in the sequel as well. Now, this was Hellraiser, and I do hope you give it a look-see. And as for any of my stuff, if you're interested in hearing me ramble about other things, I mean, I just write these for the fun of things. You can check out more of them if you like. They're under the same name on YouTube, and you're probably... well, this is in a playlist of just everything. Yeah. Thanks for listening, listeners.